What if I told you the North Vietnamese Army had a standing order to drop their weapons and run from exactly one American unit? No marching, no supply trucks, just heavily armed phantoms dropping directly out of the sky into the deepest, deadliest jungles on Earth. By 1963, Washington was panicking. The mighty American war machine was failing. Tanks were sinking in the mud. The enemy was invisible. The Pentagon was terrified they were going to lose the war, so they authorized a desperate, highly controversial experiment. Old-school generals absolutely hated it. They tried to destroy the project before it even started. They called it pure mass suicide. But this rogue idea birthed the most terrifying, lethal killing machine the Vietnam War ever saw. The enemy called them sky horses. And when they heard the roar of those rotor blades, they knew death was only seconds away. Today, we are ripping the lid off the military's most explosive gamble. Forget the polished Hollywood movies. We are diving into the raw, brutal, insider truth. We are talking about classified tactics, absolute slaughter at point-blank range, and a radical military strategy that changed warfare forever. Do not click away. Watch this video until the very last second. Because the dark, bloody secret of what really happened at Landing Zone Albany is something the military establishment hoped you would never find out. Lock and load. Let's drop in. In 1963, the highest echelons of the American military establishment found themselves sweating bullets inside the heavily guarded, air-conditioned briefing rooms of the Pentagon. The most powerful mechanized fighting force ever assembled on the face of the planet was facing utter humiliation at the hands of an invisible adversary in Southeast Asia. Top-tier generals stared in absolute disbelief at highly classified maps, suddenly realizing that their conventional military doctrine was completely useless in this terrifying new theater of operations. South Vietnam was not a traditional battlefield with neat front lines and wide-open plains where massive armored columns could comfortably maneuver. Instead, it was an unforgiving green meat grinder that mercilessly chewed up traditional infantry battalions and spat them out completely broken. The staggering geographical reality consisted of over 170,000 square kilometers of impenetrable triple canopy jungle, treacherous mountain ridgelines, and bottomless flooded rice paddies. The cunning Viet Cong and the regular North Vietnamese Army did not view this horrific terrain as an obstacle, but rather weaponized the dense wilderness to their absolute tactical advantage. They moved through the suffocating vegetation like water through sand, utilizing ancient hidden trails to cache essential supplies right under the noses of heavily armed American patrols. These phantom warriors would blend into local villages during the daylight hours, only to emerge from the shadows and launch devastating surprise attacks under the cover of darkness. The enemy absolutely refused to stand and fight on American terms, completely neutralizing the overwhelming firepower advantage of the United States Armed Forces. But this terrifying realization was merely the opening act of a much larger disaster waiting to unfold for the mighty superpower. The United States military machine of 1963 was almost perfectly engineered to lose this specific type of guerrilla conflict. Built exclusively for large-scale conventional warfare on the flat plains of Europe, the rigid doctrine relied heavily on massive, slow-moving armored vehicles and the enormous logistical chains required to sustain them. In the primitive landscape of Vietnam, the few existing roads were notoriously treacherous, the bridges were dangerously weak, and the suffocating jungle was practically everywhere. Heavy steel tanks, designed to crush Soviet armor, instantly bogged down in the treacherous mud of rural rice paddies, turning into helpless stationary targets for enemy rocket fire. Supply trucks attempting to navigate the broken highway system routinely drove straight into devastating ambushes, resulting in endless tragedies that the government desperately tried to hide from the American public. Even the legendary American artillery, the undeniable king of the battlefield, became a frustrating liability in this chaotic tropical environment. Moving a single heavy howitzer battery into a viable firing position took agonizing days of clearing dense vegetation and laying down temporary roads. Once these massive guns were finally established, they remained entirely static and incredibly vulnerable to the very same elusive insurgents they were supposed to neutralize. The entire American military apparatus was simply too loud, too profoundly slow, and far too dependent on non-existent road networks to chase down a highly mobile adversary. It became glaringly obvious to anyone paying attention that continuing down this traditional path would lead directly to an unprecedented military catastrophe. Yet, salvation would soon arrive from the most unexpected and incredibly controversial source imaginable. Enter General Hamilton Hueys, a radical visionary who possessed the sheer audacity to challenge the incredibly stubborn military bureaucracy of his era. This brilliant commander looked at the catastrophic situation and proposed a solution so profoundly shocking that it made traditionalist officers practically choke on their expensive cigars. His fundamental argument was a stroke of pure aggressive genius. If the ground itself prevented forward movement, then the United States Army simply had to abandon the ground entirely. American combat troops would no longer march exhausted through hostile, booby-trapped jungles, but would instead dominate the battlefield by moving exclusively through the sky. Hueys envisioned a breathtaking new reality, where helicopters would cease to be mere medical evacuation vehicles and would transform into the primary tactical transport for an entire airborne assault force. In 1962, the highly classified Army Tactical Mobility Requirements Board, widely known in inner circles as the Hueys Board, spent several grueling months analyzing this completely unprecedented concept. Their explosive final report called for the creation of a fundamentally new type of combat division, one built entirely around the rotary wing aircraft as its core vehicle of maneuver. This revolutionary fighting unit would require the unprecedented deployment of more than 400 advanced helicopters of various specialized types. It demanded the immediate invention of entirely new aerial tactics, radically different training protocols, and a completely fresh philosophical approach to modern ground combat. Implementing this wildly ambitious strategy would force the government to invest astronomical sums of taxpayer money into a theoretical idea that had never been tested in actual combat conditions. But this bold proposal immediately ignited the most vicious bureaucratic civil war the Pentagon had ever witnessed. Furious traditionalist generals whose prestigious careers and enormous egos were deeply tied to heavy armor and classic infantry maneuvers launched a massive political counterattack against the Hueys Board. These old-school commanders publicly ridiculed the Airmobile concept as an untested, wildly dangerous fantasy that would inevitably lead to unprecedented tragedies on the battlefield. They aggressively questioned whether fragile, incredibly expensive, and highly vulnerable helicopters could possibly survive an intense combat drop against heavily armed ground forces. Skeptics loudly demanded to know how any human pilot could accurately navigate and successfully deliver troops amid the blinding smoke and absolute chaos of a tropical firefight. They confidently declared that the monumental logistics of supplying aviation fuel and spare parts to a massive helicopter fleet in a primitive jungle environment were absolutely impossible to maintain. The fierce political arguments echoing through the halls of Washington grew incredibly toxic, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed the revolutionary Airmobile concept would be quietly buried in a dusty committee room. Fortunately for the future of the armed forces, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara possessed a legendary appetite for unconventional thinking and hard quantitative data. Recognizing the catastrophic failures of traditional doctrine, McNamara completely bypassed the furious old-school generals and decisively ordered the military to test the radical concept in the real world. This bold executive mandate led directly to the historic activation of the 11th Air Assault Division test at Fort Benning, Georgia, in the freezing month of February 1963. Here, far from the prying eyes of the hostile press, a select group of visionary soldiers and incredibly brave aviators began the painstaking work of turning a controversial theory into a formidable reality. However, the path to building this ultimate airborne weapon was paved with extreme danger and shocking setbacks. For 2 incredibly intense years, the dedicated personnel at Fort Benning pushed themselves and their complex machines to the absolute breaking point. They relentlessly developed completely new tactical manuals from scratch, mercilessly tested experimental flight equipment, and ran massive operational exercises that grew steadily more complex and physically demanding. These classified tests were far from perfect, featuring terrifying mechanical failures, near-miss accidents, and moments of profound doubt that threatened to derail the entire expensive program. Aviators had to learn how to fly heavily loaded transport helicopters in tight, completely unprecedented formations, while heavily armed infantrymen practiced leaping from hovering skids into simulated combat zones. Every single day was a brutal physical and mental grind, specifically designed to weed out weakness and forge a completely new breed of highly mobile, incredibly aggressive combat soldier. Despite the immense physical toll and the relentless pressure from political skeptics, the astonishing results of these massive war games eventually became impossible for the Pentagon to deny. By the sweltering summer of 1965, the radical Airmobile concept had overwhelmingly proven its devastating effectiveness, showcasing a level of rapid battlefield maneuverability that conventional forces could not even comprehend. The experimental division demonstrated the mind-blowing ability to lift an entire artillery battery, fly at dozens of miles over impassable terrain, and have the heavy guns firing in a matter of hours. This unprecedented capability to instantly project massive combat power anywhere on the map absolutely shattered all previous limitations of strategic military planning. The United States government finally realized they possessed the exact weapon needed to hunt down and utterly neutralize the elusive jungle phantoms of Southeast Asia. And what happened next would forever alter the brutal landscape of the entire global conflict. On the historic 1st of July, 1965, the military establishment finally pulled the trigger on the most expensive and daring tactical experiment in American history. The legendary 1st Cavalry Division was officially redesignated as a fully airmobile force and immediately received its classified orders to deploy to the blazing combat zones of South Vietnam. This incredibly lethal new formation was strictly designed to carry more than 430 heavily armed helicopters straight into the fiery heart of the conflict. The men of this elite unit knew they were leaving behind every established rule of traditional warfare to become the ultimate apex predators of the tropical skies. They were no longer just regular soldiers, they were highly specialized airborne shock troops ready to unleash absolute devastation from above. When these heavily armed warriors finally arrived in the sprawling, dangerous highlands of Southeast Asia, they brought with them a completely unprecedented method of tactical dominance. The sheer logistical scale of their massive helicopter fleet completely overwhelmed the senses of anyone who witnessed it, transforming the quiet jungle air into a deafening symphony of roaring turbine engines. The division quickly constructed an enormous staging base, carving out a colossal helicopter landing area so unbelievably massive that it could clearly be seen from low Earth orbit. Every single soldier, pilot, and mechanic knew they were participating in a monumental shift in human conflict, armed with the ultimate technological advantage over a cunning and heavily entrenched enemy. The stage was finally set for the ultimate showdown, and the fearsome sky horses were officially ready to demonstrate their terrifying new power to the world. The steaming autumn of 1965 would forever be etched into military history as the moment the American military completely rewrote the rules of engagement. Deep inside the treacherous central highlands of South Vietnam lay the infamous Drang Valley, a heavily fortified sanctuary completely controlled by the enemy. For months, the North Vietnamese Army had secretly amassed a massive force of approximately 8,000 battle-hardened soldiers in this remote, deeply hidden location. Their elite commanders arrogantly believed their sprawling base camps were absolutely untouchable by conventional American ground forces. They were absolutely convinced that the impenetrable jungle canopy would shield them from any sudden Allied offensive. But these seasoned enemy veterans were about to experience a terrifying new reality that would shatter their arrogant confidence forever. On the 14th of November, 1965, the devastating fury of the 1st Cavalry Division finally rained down upon the unsuspecting adversary. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore boldly led 450 fearless warriors of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry directly into a massive enemy stronghold designated as Landing Zone X-Ray. These brave Americans literally dropped from the sky right into the operational headquarters of the massive 33rd North Vietnamese Regiment. Almost immediately, the jungle erupted into a chaotic inferno of flying lead, deafening explosions, and unimaginable tactical pressure. The heavily outnumbered American paratroopers found themselves completely surrounded by an overwhelming hostile force of nearly 2,000 vicious fighters. The incredibly disciplined North Vietnamese commanders quickly deployed their most brutal and desperate combat strategy, famously known to historians as hugging the belt. This ruthless tactic required their infantry to sprint forward and engage the Americans at absolute point-blank range, deliberately mixing the front lines together. By staying violently close to the American positions, the enemy desperately hoped to neutralize the catastrophic threat of massive Allied air support. The combat was so incredibly tight that soldiers could literally hear enemy officers screaming tactical orders through the dense tropical foliage. It was an apocalyptic test of pure human endurance, where every single inch of ground was defended with unimaginable ferocity. But the enemy fundamentally misunderstood the apocalyptic mechanical monster they had just carelessly awakened. The 1st Cavalry Division was not merely a standard infantry unit, but a flawlessly integrated engine of total devastation built entirely around rotary wing aviation. While Moore's men heroically held the shrinking defensive perimeter, an endless stream of American helicopters continuously dove through heavy enemy fire to deliver critical reinforcements and vital ammunition. Massive artillery batteries were lifted into perfectly coordinated supporting positions significantly faster than the enemy could ever hope to react. For the first time in modern history, massive B-52 strategic bombers were called in for devastating close support, completely vaporizing entire enemy formations in seconds. By the 16th of November, the adversary had suffered a catastrophic defeat, with over 634 hostile fighters permanently eliminated in the immediate battle area alone. Yet, this incredible display of aerial dominance was merely the calm before a truly devastating and heartbreaking storm. The terrifying reality of this new warfare style revealed its absolute darkest face just one day later, on the 17th of November, 1965. The brave men of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, were temporarily forced to move on foot through the suffocating jungle toward a new objective, called Landing Zone Albany. Without the protective mobility of their helicopters, the heavily exhausted American column walked directly into a massive, perfectly executed ambush by the hostile 66th Regiment. The cunning enemy aggressively split the American formation into isolated pockets, immediately turning the dense vegetation into a chaotic nightmare of close-quarters tragedy. In these suffocating conditions, the legendary American air support became virtually impossible to utilize without risking catastrophic, friendly fire incidents. The ensuing engagement instantly became the most devastating single incident of the entire campaign for the American Armed Forces. In a matter of agonizing hours, 151 American heroes made the ultimate sacrifice, while another 121 suffered severe battle wounds. This brutal tragedy served as a massive, incredibly bloody wake-up call for the Pentagon regarding the absolute limits of their new tactical doctrine. It proved conclusively that whenever Airmobile troops were stripped of their aerial advantage and caught on foot, they bled exactly like traditional infantrymen. The enemy finally learned that their only hope for tactical survival was to drag the Americans down into the mud and fight them at arm's length. But out of this terrifying crucible, an unstoppable mechanical monster fully emerged that would permanently break the psychological will of the adversary. To truly comprehend the sheer terror the North Vietnamese felt, you must understand the colossal, incredibly complex machine operating behind the scenes. The legendary 1st Cavalry Division was essentially a giant flying conveyor belt of devastation that required millions of taxpayer dollars to function every single day. The absolute backbone of this terrifying logistical system was the iconic UH-1 Iroquois, universally recognized by military historians as the legendary Huey. At the absolute peak of the conflict, the division utilized a staggering fleet of over 400 of these incredibly versatile machines. They operated flawlessly as heavy gunships, rapid medical transports, and lightning-fast assault vehicles that could insert heavily armed squads anywhere on the map. But the true heavy hitter of the Airmobile revolution was an absolute beast of aviation engineering known as the CH-47 Chinook. This massive, incredibly powerful helicopter was the ultimate secret weapon that completely rewrote the mathematical equations of battlefield logistics. Weighing over 20,000 kilograms, the mighty Chinook could effortlessly lift massive 105mm artillery pieces directly over impassable mountain ranges. A complete battery of 6 heavy howitzers could be extracted from one combat zone, flown over 50 kilometers, and be fully operational in mere hours. This unprecedented capability delivered a level of rapid, devastating fire support that no conventional military force in human history had ever possessed. However, the ultimate secret behind this devastating firepower was not the magnificent machines themselves, but the extraordinary men who operated them. This colossal mechanical beast was meticulously maintained by an absolute army of highly skilled mechanics, avionics technicians, and dedicated support crews. These unsung heroes worked completely around the clock in suffocating tropical heat, blinding dust storms, and torrential monsoon rains just to keep the heavy rotors spinning. Every single day they executed hundreds of incredibly complex mechanical repairs while constantly facing the looming threat of sudden enemy mortar attacks. Without their incredible dedication and mechanical genius, the entire billion-dollar Airmobile concept would have crashed directly into the unforgiving Vietnamese mud. Their relentless labor perfectly ensured that the fearsome sky horses were always ready to answer the desperate radio calls of troops in contact. But it was the incredibly fearless American aviators who truly transformed these metal machines into the absolute worst nightmare of the North Vietnamese Army. These incredibly brave pilots executed their missions in a violent, unpredictable tropical environment that was absolutely nothing like the safe training grounds of Georgia. They boldly flew their unarmored aircraft directly into blazing landing zones, calmly hovering through thick walls of hostile AK-47 fire to rescue their brothers. By the end of their historic deployment, these legendary aviators had successfully executed more than 1 million highly dangerous operational sorties. They completely shattered the enemy's psyche, proving to the entire world that absolutely no enemy sanctuary was beyond the deadly reach of the American military. In the gloomy month of January 1968, the horrifying siege of Quezon forcefully gripped the absolute full attention of a terrified American public watching the evening news broadcasts. A vital Marine combat base, located in the incredibly remote northwestern corner of South Vietnam, suddenly found itself completely surrounded by approximately 20,000 heavily armed, battle-hardened North Vietnamese soldiers. The ruthless enemy commanders aggressively sought to recreate the legendary tragedy of Dien Bien Phu, desperately hoping to completely destroy the trapped American garrison and publicly humiliate the United States on the massive global stage. The extreme political pressure was absolutely overwhelming, with President Lyndon Johnson reportedly becoming so incredibly consumed by the terrifying prospect of a catastrophic defeat that he ordered a massive scale model of the entire battlefield built directly inside the heavily guarded White House Situation Room. The situation looked absolutely desperate for the brave Marines who were forced to freeze in their muddy, rat-infested trenches while enduring an unimaginable, around-the-clock barrage of incoming heavy artillery fire. But the incredibly arrogant enemy commanders had critically miscalculated the absolutely unbelievable rescue capabilities of the most mobile military machine on the face of the earth. On the very first day of April 1968, the legendary 1st Cavalry Division launched the spectacularly successful Operation Pegasus, a breathtaking display of unmatched tactical dominance that would forever echo through the prestigious halls of global military academies. Instead of foolishly committing to a slow, predictable relief column driving straight up the heavily mined and heavily defended Route 9, the brilliant cavalry commanders orchestrated a spectacular series of massive airborne leaps right over the heads of the completely shocked enemy formations. Wave after wave of roaring transport helicopters violently descended upon vital strategic elevated positions, completely bypassing the heavily fortified North Vietnamese defensive lines that had taken months to dig out of the hard earth. The utterly bewildered enemy forces suddenly found themselves completely isolated, instantly surrounded from the sky, and absolutely incapable of mounting any coordinated counterattack against this massive, multi-directional airborne assault. By utilizing their unparalleled vertical mobility, the American forces completely dictated the furious pace of the engagement, forcing the exhausted adversary to constantly react to threats materializing literally out of thin air. By the 15th of April, 1968, elements of the legendary 1st Cavalry successfully linked up with the deeply exhausted but incredibly grateful Marine garrison, completely shattering the massive 77-day siege in merely 15 days of highly aggressive maneuvers. The vaunted North Vietnamese 9th Division, which had arrogantly planned the total destruction of the isolated American base, was completely obliterated and forced to scatter into the dense surrounding wilderness by the relentless airborne pressure. The 1st Cavalry Division essentially proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that absolutely no American military outpost was ever truly cut off from salvation, as long as the mighty Skyhorses controlled the turbulent heavens. The deeply humiliated enemy was forced to frantically retreat back into the dark shadows, leaving behind thousands of their fallen comrades and an absolute, undeniable tactical failure of epic proportions. Yet, the absolutely most spectacular and highly controversial offensive operation of the entire global conflict was still secretly waiting just over the supposedly impenetrable international border. In the scorching month of May 1970, President Richard Nixon made a profoundly explosive, highly controversial political decision to authorize massive, classified cross-border operations directly into the sovereign territory of neighboring Cambodia. The primary, highly classified target for the legendary 1st Cavalry Division was the shadowy central command center of the adversary, a deeply hidden nerve center directly controlling the entire communist campaign in the southern region. For many long years, the cunning North Vietnamese had arrogantly utilized these vast Cambodian sanctuaries as completely safe havens, totally confident that cautious American politicians would never officially allow their combat troops to cross the sacred international boundary. The enemy had spent over half a decade carefully constructing an unbelievable logistical empire completely hidden beneath the dense jungle canopy of a notorious border region, widely known among intelligence circles as the fishhook. When the deafening American helicopters finally crossed that forbidden line and aggressively dropped heavily armed troops directly into the massive sanctuary, they uncovered an absolute jaw-dropping prize that defied all rational expectations. Instead of discovering just a simple, temporary command post, the bewildered cavalrymen stumbled upon a colossal, sprawling metropolis of underground bunkers that utterly shocked American officers, quickly dubbed the City. This massive, incredibly sophisticated hidden complex contained enormous fully equipped surgical hospitals, extensive combat training facilities, and subterranean logistical warehouses stretching across several square kilometers of dense, unforgiving tropical forest. The staggering scale of this completely secret enemy base absolutely stunned even the most hardened military intelligence veterans sitting in their comfortable offices back in Washington. The massive inventory of captured enemy equipment was an unprecedented strategic triumph that permanently crippled the hostile supply lines for many agonizing years to come. American troops triumphantly seized thousands of highly devastating modern assault rifles, literally millions of rounds of heavy combat ammunition, and hundreds of thousands of pounds of vital rice supplies required to feed an entire advancing army. Top military analysts boldly estimated that this single, devastating airborne raid successfully neutralized enough critical enemy provisions to completely sustain their aggressive combat operations for 2 to 3 entire years. The legendary 1st Cavalry Division practically amputated the main logistical lifeline of the Communist forces in a matter of days, proving once again that absolutely no hidden enemy sanctuary was ever truly safe from their thunderous, overwhelming reach. But far beyond the massive piles of captured foreign weapons and destroyed enemy bunkers, the absolute greatest weapon forged by this elite division was the sheer, paralyzing psychological terror they constantly inflicted. By the dark year of 1969, the deeply traumatized North Vietnamese Army had spent over 3 horrifying years desperately trying to develop effective tactical countermeasures against the seemingly unstoppable Airmobile juggernaut. They ruthlessly trained highly specialized anti-aircraft teams to hide near potential jungle landing zones, desperately hoping to bring down the incoming transport helicopters during their absolute most vulnerable hovering moments just above the tall grass. They launched massive, incredibly violent nighttime infantry assaults against isolated American artillery fire support bases, frantically trying to completely overrun the fortified positions before the rapid airborne reinforcements could arrive and turn the tide of the desperate battle. But despite their absolute fanaticism and their terrifying willingness to absorb completely catastrophic human casualties, the enemy simply could not replicate or neutralize the breathtaking, mind-bending speed of the American aerial response. Every single time the adversary attempted to stand their ground and fight a conventional battle, they were absolutely decimated by an overwhelming avalanche of rockets, artillery shells, and highly trained riflemen dropping directly from the stormy clouds. The ultimate undeniable proof of the legendary 1st Cavalry Division's absolute supremacy was the profound, well-documented fear permanently ingrained into the dark hearts of their most fanatical adversaries. Even the most brilliant and notoriously arrogant enemy commanders, including the legendary General Vo Nguyen Giap, privately admitted that the incredible American air mobility was the single greatest tactical threat they ever faced during the entire brutal, decade-long conflict. For the average, deeply exhausted North Vietnamese soldier hiding in the dense foliage, the distinct, rhythmic chopping sound of an approaching Huey helicopter was universally considered the absolute most terrifying noise on the entire planet. That unmistakable, thumping roar meant their highly classified defensive positions were suddenly discovered, their carefully laid ambush plans were completely ruined, and a devastating wall of fiery aerial firepower was mere seconds away from turning their jungle haven into a blazing inferno of ultimate tragedy. The terrifying realization that the Americans could instantly strike anywhere, at any time, with absolutely overwhelming force permanently shattered the fighting spirit of countless enemy battalions. This unprecedented psychological dominance permanently cemented the glorious legacy of a massive military experiment that completely changed the very fabric of human conflict forever. The incredible, fearless pioneers of the radical Airmobile concept fundamentally shattered the ancient, outdated military belief that difficult geographical terrain could magically provide a safe sanctuary for an outgunned guerrilla insurgency. The heroic, incredibly tough men who proudly wore the massive yellow and black horsehead patch boldly proved that helicopters were not just fragile supply vehicles, but the absolute, undisputed apex predators of the highly dangerous modern battlefield. They took the absolute worst, most heavily defended, and deeply hostile jungle environments on Earth and completely transformed them into their own personal, highly dominant hunting grounds. The miserable days of marching exhausted, heavily burdened infantrymen slowly through hostile, booby-trapped territory were officially over, replaced forever by the breathtaking shock and awe of overwhelming vertical envelopment. They completely rewrote the rulebook of global combat, introducing a level of terrifying mobility that left the entire world watching in absolute stunned silence. Today, the deeply revolutionary tactics forged in blood, sweat, and intense fire by the 1st Cavalry Division remain the absolute bedrock foundation of the incredibly powerful modern United States Army. Every single modern air assault operation executed around the globe, every rapid helicopter extraction in hostile territory, and every daring Special Forces night raid traces its glorious, unbreakable lineage directly back to those steaming tropical valleys of 1965. The legendary Sky Horses completely rewrote the complex mathematical equations of ground warfare, demonstrating an unprecedented level of mobility and lethal force that continues to deeply intimidate hostile nations and terrorize rogue dictatorships around the entire globe. They were the undisputed, heavily armed gods of the jungle, the phantom riders of the stormy sky, and the absolute ultimate, inescapable nightmare for any hostile enemy foolish enough to stand in their destructive way.